Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hadley Gamble. I'm with CNBC News. I'm the anchor and reporter and senior international correspondent for this region, and I'm thrilled to welcome you guys once again to the World Economic Forum's final plenary session. We're going to be talking about how we find a way to create an environment where stakeholders are able to advance the cause of finding cohesion and sustainability in our world. I'm really thrilled to welcome the panel today. We just had a really fun discussion offsides, so I'm hoping that we'll be able to bring some of that energy to the conversation over the next hour. If we have a bit of time at the end, we're going to open it up for questions as well, but at the moment it's just going to be the five of us. So kicking off, I'd like to introduce Sophie Punta. She's the Executive Director for Smart Freight Center, as well as Suzanne Fortier, the Principal and Vice-Chancellor at McGill University. Amandeep Singh Gill is the Project Lead for International Digital Health and Artificial Intelligence at the United Nations. And Usha Ramanori is the Senior Advisor at Blackstone Group. Panel, thank you and welcome. Kicking off, I had the idea to give each of these panelists a couple of minutes to just talk about the things that they feel are the most pressing concerns as we head into the World Economic Forum in Davos and how we should be shaping that discussion. Sophie, I'm going to kick it off with you.
Oh, thank you. Very pleased to be here. The thing that's happening, what's unique about today's world, is we have four systems that run our world. Energy, IT, finance, and transportation. And all those four systems are undergoing disruption. And as a result, the entire industry is being transformed. Now, what that means in practice is that companies of today, of the Standard & Poor's 500, only half of them will disappear in the next 10 years. Where 30 years ago, that was maybe 10% of those. So as a result, companies are going to really rethink their future in society, meaning they move beyond purely finance. They need to think about sustainable development goals. And what that means in practice is that companies have to rethink what they mean by value. You have shareholder value or shareholder returns and stakeholder value or stakeholder returns. And what that means in practice is that, for example, companies will have their annual report is integrated, not a separate sustainability and a finance report, but one integrated report. I predict that any company that's going to be future-proof is going to have a CEO, a CFO, a COO, but also a Chief Sustainability Officer, or you won't survive. If you're true to sustainable development goals and you want to display diversity, you cannot have an all-male board. You cannot even have an all-Western board. It needs to be a representation of society, or you will not be in touch with society. And in relation to that, I think the key message that I would hope we can talk about a little bit more is what this means in practice and bringing some practical examples from companies together. And I think the councils here at BEF represent those sustainable development goals, including transportation, which is not an SDG, but is a dedicated council. We have a dedicated council on transportation I'm part of. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues in the room from the council. Are you here?
Representing.
Thank you.
Suzanne.
Bonjour à vous tous. We've been talking for the last few days about the future of education and jobs, of work. I think we'll start with what everybody, I think, knows, and that is that jobs are changing. Certain kinds of jobs are disappearing. New jobs will be created. We might not know what they are yet. And so we have to think about how do we equip people for this reality. Now, of course, we have to think about the fact that people do want to be employed. They have to be job ready today, in 5 years from now, in 20 years from now, in 25 years from now. It can be summarized as how do we prepare people to be both job ready, future ready. Now, it's much easier to think about job ready for today or even 5 years from now. We see the trends. We know that disruptive technology, globalization, all sorts of forces are changing jobs. We can predict what the new jobs will look like or what new elements of the jobs would be needed, what new skills will be needed. It's much harder to think about 25 years from now. We don't know what it's going to be looking at like. And I think that where we need to get is what is it that is unique about human beings? We talk a lot about artificial intelligence. we need to spend a little bit more time thinking about human intelligence. What is it that we are uniquely able to contribute? Because this is where we will be needed in 25 years from now, in 50 years from now. So let's focus on the unique aspect of who we are as human beings and prepare ourselves for it. This is a pretty difficult task, and I think it will require for us to work together, the education sector, society at large, the employers, and so on, so that we can have this perspective that is both short-term and long-term.
Amandeep.
Pleasure to be here. I want to start by telling two stories from the tech governance domain. The first is from the bio domain. In 2011, we gathered together in Geneva for a review conference of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. And it had been 2 years since the CRISPR-Cas9 technique had been invented. This is a technique for editing DNA in a new way so that you can drive changes, genomic changes across generations. And of the hundreds of experts gathered in that room, including scientists, academics, and people who follow the repurposable nature of these technologies for a living, none of them mentioned CRISPR-Cas9. And it was only in 2016 that we started to talk about that technology. So this gap between the pace of tech development and the policy response to that, even at that international level, is mind-boggling and is growing. The other story I want to bring in today is from the field of artificial intelligence. So in 2017 and 2018, when I was leading a negotiation on lethal autonomous weapon systems, again at Geneva, in the room, people discussing the issue were retrofitting their mindsets onto a technology which they didn't really understand. So diplomats, military experts, international lawyers were bringing in their own mindsets onto this, and there were hardly any private sector practitioners there. So you needed to bring in that industry perspective to actually understand what's the technology, what's the nature of that technology, and can we really regulate it with the kind of 20th century, 19th century tools we have. So these are some of the problems, tech governance, which I love to talk about a little later in our conversation. My main point would be that practice and inclusion makes perfect. So you need to get a few things right, and of those, practice-based governance and inclusive and distributed governance are the most important.
Usha.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. As a member of the Infrastructure Council, I think we spent the last 2 days having a very rich discussion around the future of infrastructure. What we took away from that was that the infrastructure of tomorrow really cannot be like the infrastructure of yesterday or even today, number one. Number two, it really should be constructed to create inclusion, as you said, Amandeep. It should be constructed to adhere to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it should be resilient. Ultimately, infrastructure is the foundation of economic growth for the planet, and it should take into account the needs of the planet as well. So where we came out, and it was a very long discussion, is what are the elements of this new infrastructure model, right? What could they be? We don't know is the answer, and that's what's going to be the next year of discussions and work. But what we do know is that it'll have certain elements, and those elements will be a different finance model, a different innovation model. Innovation here meaning technology as well as business model. A different infrastructure design model, perhaps. And finally, a different governance model. And all of these things have to come together with the last and most important point, which is the participation of all stakeholders, particularly communities. So this is not just a public sector discussion or a private sector, it's everybody. And one of the things also that we discussed, which is kind of important, people tend to not think about it, is that in creating a multi-stakeholder approach to future infrastructure, one important stakeholder is the incumbent, or the legacy asset holder, or the legacy structuring person, who has been building infrastructure in a certain way that may now and should now adapt to what the future infrastructure should be.
Sophie, I'd like you to pick up on that point in terms of, as a business, how you adapt to these changing dynamics, because it has to be the private sector and the public sector, but certainly the private sector has to do it generally in the beginning for the public sector to follow along.
I can give two examples. One is for infrastructure. There's an initiative called Navigating a Changing Climate. And what they try and do is work with port authorities to already make the ports prepared for a time when there's more storms and when the sea level rises. So what it means is they don't make like super high walls, but they build the infrastructure in such a way that the moment you need to make things higher or stronger, it can be added on top of that. So that's one. Another one that I really think is going to be key is that companies are going to think circular. We're talking about circular economy. Let me give an example. Plastic, at the moment, 9% of plastic is recycled, only 9%. And if we continue the way we are doing now, by 2050 there's going to be more plastic in the sea than fish. So how companies can respond is not by merely saying we're going to do more recycling. They should become the users of the plastic that's currently being recovered from the oceans and thinking, how can I in my supply chain use that? And one example is a company called Interface. They make carpets. And they've been thinking circular from the very beginning. They take carpets back from customers, so they have it placed, and the moment you don't want your carpets anymore, they take it back. But they're also looking at different sources for the raw material of carpets, which is polymer 6. So in Philippines, they set up a scheme whereby they're giving money for fishermen to hand in their old fishing nets, which otherwise would end up in the sea, because that is a raw material for making the carpets. So along with taking back the carpets, recycling or reusing up to 98% of the carpet, they've also found a sustainable use for what otherwise would have been a waste, and that would end up in the environment and being very destructive. And that thinking about not just recycling, but how can I make my entire industrial process circular, using what's already out there as a waste product, rather than getting more and more out of the ground and using more resources that are very limited.
Amandeep, I want you to weigh in terms of the opportunities for technology and artificial intelligence, because at CNBC we do quite a lot of coverage these days about the evils of technology and about so many worries that not just everyday folks, but governments have, companies frankly have, in terms of security. But where do we use this to our advantage?
I think that's the balance we should strive for. You mentioned the leapfrogging opportunity in a sense, but then the risks of misuse. So between misuse and misuse, so we have to strike a balance. And by focusing on good use, we turn minds away from potential bad application. Like, you don't tell someone to not think of a fish riding a bicycle. You take the mind to something else, like a painting on the wall. So you can't just tell people don't do bad or don't be evil. So we need to put examples of well-governed, ethical, society-benefiting technologies out there. So we need to bend the arc of investment away from sex bots and other potentially, in a sense, problematic uses of technology to using technology to precisely address the problem of the growing amount of plastics in the oceans. So we need to create an excitement around that aspect. The misuse is very important, but that's only part of the conversation. That focuses a lot of minds in North America and Western Europe. But when you go out to Africa, to India, to China, there's an excitement about using the opportunity, not missing out. So we have to balance this.
And then, Usha, you wanted to weigh in on that one, because it's something we had touched on a little earlier.
Right, so from what you were saying, look, I think from an infrastructure point of view, technology is definitely considered an enabler, and a very important enabler. What it enables is, as you said, the opportunity or the space for leapfrogging. In other words, just because the developed world did something in infrastructure 20 years ago, 50 years ago, does not mean that the developing country has to do the same thing. They have an opportunity, potentially, to use technology to get to a different place. Telecom and the cell phone and so on comes to mind. But also importantly from our perspective is that we believe, and this has to be checked out, that technology will also be a great equalizer of those who have access to infrastructure and those who have not. And that means that when we look into the future, one of the things we see is potentially the movement, gradual, from a centralized infrastructure model to a more decentralized one. And once you start getting more decentralized, you need an enabler of that decentralization, which inevitably is technology of one sort or the other. And you warned me in that room, please don't come at me with, I want blockchain. Yeah, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying it should be an enabler of what we're trying to achieve.
And in terms of what happens next in terms of the human element, I've been covering World Economic Conferences for about the last decade, and we talk so often about the benefits of technology and the excitement surrounding the fourth industrial revolution and how we find ways to integrate this in a productive and sustainable way. But I thought it was really interesting in the conversations we were having offsides about how much the human element is really changing the way that we look at technology. And I think that's something that Suzanne can speak to, because it's something that's very, very important.
Yeah, and I'll bring the human element in the conversation we just had about technology. Is it evil? Is it going to create bad? My view is that any knowledge, any tools we make can be used for good or bad. So what is it that helps us to decide what we'll do with it? And it is the human element, it is the principles, it is the values. That is part of what we learn, both in our families, in our communities, throughout our education. And I think it is very important that we develop that sense of human element, that we care about each other as communities, that we build a sense of community. That's where we draw the values that will help us use technology for good, not for bad. And so that's why I say, perhaps you can program that, I'm sure you can, program ethics and so on into a computer. But it starts with human defining what it is that they want to see living together as community locally, as community globally. And we need to spend time with that. And with technology, if there's one thing that surprised me with technology is how slow we are in addressing the issues that come with the impact on humans and the impact on societies. You know, AI, as far as I'm concerned, started in 1950-something with Turing. So we knew it was coming. When I think of precision medicine, well, the genome was 1990, so we should have known this was coming. So why are we so slow in paying attention to the impact on society and saying, this is coming, it's not for tomorrow, but it will be in our future. And so let's start thinking about the ethics, let's start thinking about the regulation, the legal systems that we will need when those things are implemented in our communities.
And how do you use this, Usha, when we talk about encouraging what we were saying, the vested interests or the companies who really need to change their infrastructure dynamic, change their development models, but at the same point are being held back internally and externally by this sort of societal construct that we put on the technology? And I think part of that goes to the big words like blockchain, like fintech. How many blockchain and fintech conversations do I have on a regular basis coming from the financial world and the financial news sector? And you have to really wonder if these people actually really understand the technologies they're really talking about. As you were saying, Amandeep, I mean, this is the question, isn't it? How do you apply this sort of human element to the conversation?
I think, look, from an infrastructure angle, right, I think what we do know is that we have a stock of infrastructure that is based on yesterday and today. We have a flow that is already being built out that is also based on yesterday and today. Those are who we call the incumbents or the legacy asset holders. Now, from our perspective and being an optimist by nature, I believe they also see that the future is uncertain and that what they build today or tomorrow even may not be resilient for the next 50 years. So I think the way, as I said at the beginning, the way to bring them into the circle is to bring them into the circle and talk to them and say, look, this is where we would wish to go. Technology can be an enabler. Other things can be an enabler. How do you then adapt your infrastructure model that you have today to that? inevitably it becomes a discussion around cost. And it's something that we're going to have to deal with. And that's why our council was talking about how do you bring the public and private sides of finance into a more sensible and sensitive model to fund both the adaptation of current models and the creation of new models. Does that make sense?
So you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing that keeps coming back in this discussion, there's so much more need for collaboration. I think the world in the past seemed to be much easier. You know, you had the engineers and you had the finances, different. Right now, we cannot address the world's problems anymore in those silos. We need to go across borders, and that's uncomfortable. And I think part of what the global councils here do is bridging those gaps by having different councils also talk to each other and making sure we start interacting across the disciplines. And one point I wanted to make around technology, because I come across it a lot. I work on freight transportation, and my aim is to make freight globally zero emissions. Right now it's 8% of global emissions and largely ignored. And a key solution people come up with, oh, you know what, we'll electrify. So we'll make electric trucks and electric vans, and I'm all in favor for that. However, the moment I see a truck driving through Amsterdam or anywhere else that says zero emissions bus or zero emissions truck, without having looked at where does the electricity come from, I think you're sending a wrong message. So what I mean to say by that, the moment you start looking at a technology such as electric vehicles, you need to think about where does the electricity come from, but also how are those batteries being produced, because they're minerals, metals needed that might come from Africa, where there's a big human rights issue. You cannot anymore isolate problems and have simple technological solutions like the silver bullet, one fits all. It is uncomfortable, but it's absolutely necessary to think in a system and think holistically. And coming back to sustainable development goals, for me, that is sort of a framework that allows us to assess, are we ticking all those 17 boxes when we're introducing something
And
new?
then how do you sell this message to a global community that's, in a sense, over-crisised, as we were discussing? How do you get that message abroad? I mean, is this essential? And it's education, but it's also the application of technology to enable that education, isn't it?
Right, so we have an awareness problem, we have an entry barrier to the discussion problem, and I see that problem even in the most advanced countries. Senators, parliamentarians, regulators, etc. They find it hard to really understand this, and either they go with the flow, so what the tech sector throws at you, you take it, or they become very conservative. So we need to, one, raise the level of awareness in the room, the artificial intelligence discussion. So you needed to bring in the industry also to understand what's happening. Because regulation can no longer be abstract. You cannot govern without doing. So you have to create these dynamic loops between the practice and the governance and the regulation. Without that, it becomes too abstract. You can't keep up with the technology, and you lose out on some interesting collaboration opportunities. Because the private sector also wants to do good, so maybe they can help you do this together. I think the other aspect is inclusion. If you want to handle the risks, you need to be diverse from the beginning. Excluding people, not having diverse teams looking at problems is not only the wrong thing to do, it's immoral, but it's also enhancing the risk in the deployment, in the rollout of the technology. And for governance internationally, if you don't have the youthful, dynamic geographies of Africa, Asia, and Latin America in the conversation, then the governance models, the structure, the architectures are not going to be sustainable in the long run. And then you can't have, I mean, the international-minded idealists since Jean-Jacques Rousseau have had this elegant design in mind. And I don't think we can any longer have that kind of an. So you need a distributed design where you can adapt it to local conditions, some things that are best governed nationally, other things that are best governed by the industry through standards, other benchmarks. There's some things that you can best handle at the international level. These values and principles, the human rights standards, and some of the other high-level guidance that cuts across cultures, and that's helpful to communities nationally and lower down in doing the right thing.
Suzanne.
Yes, I want to get back to yesterday, actually, one of the first things that we heard from Lee Howell, actually, was that we need to look at system-level change. I think he's right, and he added to that that we need to move from a project-based approach, project managing-based approach, to system leadership. And that's, I think, the right thing. It's the right approach. But we can't fool ourselves. This is really hard. Systems are complex, they're dynamic, they're not entirely predictable accurately. They can be quite messy. And we know that from other systems, whether it's the weather system, the biological system, the financial systems. We know all of these things. So if we're looking for simple solution to system-level problems, I think we are probably fooling ourselves. We need to, I think, understand that what we're doing is absolutely important and incredibly difficult. And let's work together to achieve that, but it's not going to be easy.
I agree. But perhaps one way of looking at it, which is kind of how we were trying to look at it in our council, is two things. One, maybe looking at it as a system is overcomplicating things, but at least as far as the infrastructure space is concerned and solutions in that space are concerned, the dots are not yet connected. By that I mean, people are looking at various pieces of the infrastructure problem, all important, very good, deep dive sort of studies, but they're all silos in and of themselves, and they're not connecting up. So does the connecting up of dots mean that that's a system? Maybe not, but it's a step towards a system. The second thing that we also think in terms of a more systemic look is really putting ourselves on a pathway to where we wish to go. That, for me, is really, really important, because
The
in
pathway can be
infrastructure,
actually
at least,
more
yeah,
important than the actual end solution,
We are
if you ever
here.
get there, yeah.
we need to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Let's make sure at least we're on the right pathway, and we have what people are calling transition plans, because we cannot go from today to tomorrow overnight. We just can't, in anything, certainly not in infrastructure. So if those two things happen, I believe we are reasonably close to systems level thinking. That's my conviction.
I want to ask you guys to individually tell me briefly, in terms of the targets for the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, what are the targets that ought to be set? Because we're talking about a really incredible opportunity, as you all know, 50th anniversary, to see the CEOs in that room, to see the people who are leading various nations and setting these policy agendas. What are some of the targets that they need to be focused on?
Shall I start? Yeah, I'm a big believer in big commitments. In terms of climate change, which is what I'm focusing, go all the way. Commit to zero emissions, whether it's zero emissions transport, zero emissions industries. The reason is, and be dare to be saying, we know a third we can do, two-thirds probably, and the last third we don't know yet. But if we don't set a target now, we will not be honest to ourselves that we're really ambitious in trying to achieve it. If you set your target at 50%, you're going to get 30. If you get to 100, if you get to 90, if you set the target zero emissions and you get almost there, I think we make a good chance. So what I would recommend for particular CEOs or of companies to do is incorporate the sustainable development goals, embrace them, they include climate, and set some clear, tangible goals for your company so that you interpret, like you said, I think, interpret the targets for your company, what it means on the ground. For example, DHL has set the target of zero emissions logistics by 2050, and what did they start? They essentially partnered with a company that makes electric trucks. And by doing so, they now have more than 10,000 trucks on the road, and they send, more importantly, a signal to the market that electric trucks are part of the future. So, and super ambitious goals, be honest about what you already know and what you don't know, and make it concrete for within your company so that not your shareholders understand it, your staff understand it, and your stakeholders understand it, and just get going on it. And it's a journey, it's not going to go like this, it's going to go ziggy-zag. But if we don't set that ambition, we won't have it.
Yeah. Yeah. On targets, I would say that from our perspective, it would be very difficult to set global targets at this point. I think they will have to be national targets. Our realities, unfortunately, are quite different. I'll give you just one example. In my country, we have reasonable access to education, quite good access to education, and when it comes to jobs, we have a very low unemployment number right now. In fact, we have problems finding people for the jobs. You go to many African countries, it's not that situation. They have a very young population and not many jobs. So, and access to education is more difficult. But so you have to set your target, I think, at a national level. So I'll give you the target. Aggressive, you have to set, I think, like you say, aggressive targets. In my country, we're moving towards a better blend of learning and working. So we have a target that every student in our colleges and universities will have one opportunity to learn during their studies at work, in the companies and in the community. So a work-integrated learning opportunity. We need to set targets also that everyone who's working and needs to learn something else and needs to learn something new will have easy access to tools to help them do that are well adapted to their realities of a person who is working, have other maybe family obligations and so on. These are realistic targets for our country, but I wouldn't say that every country would be able to set the same targets at this point.
Nor would every company. Yes.
So my wish for Davos next year, and next year is a very important year. It's the 75th anniversary of the San Francisco Charter. Multilateralism was never easy. It's more difficult than ever before. We also need to integrate multi-stakeholderism into that. And we also need to get away from this old world, old privileges to a more inclusive multilateralism. But it's the time to commit to something. And my wish is for all the companies, all the players in the fourth IR tech space to commit to the 9 values coming out of the UN Secretary General's panel on digital cooperation. And they include human flourishing, human-centeredness, respect for human rights, inclusiveness, sustainability. That's not the end of the road, but that's the beginning. So let's first commit, all of us, to a set of values that should guide the development and deployment of these technologies. And then we can talk about coalitions around specific areas of the Sustainable Development Goals, health, which is what I'm currently working on, a number of other areas which our council, the Global Public Goods Council, has looked at. But the starting point has to be a commitment to certain human-centered values for the deployment of these technologies.
I mean, what more can I add, right? So I agree with all of that, but here's my take on it. I'm putting on my investor hat, which is...
The numbers have to add up.
Well, that, and I think commitment is important, commitment to everything all 3 of you said. Where I think my wish for Davos would be is to get the heads of state and CEOs and all the other important people that are there to start really looking into the how. I fear that there's so much time that we spend on the what and the why. 2 decades. We now have this SDGs, fantastic. What do I do with it, right? And many CEOs, many even heads of state, should start the process after making the commitments that you all correctly laid out, is to try to figure out the models, the ways forward, the pathways, the transition plans, but start moving forward rather than rehashing the crisis that's upon us. That's my wish.
In terms of the accountability, we can talk about action all we want to, but holding these leaders and holding corporates accountable is a whole different story, isn't it? And if you can help them to justify it when it comes to the bottom line, it's slightly easier, at least to sell it on the corporate side. But when you have disrupted politics, you might say, across Europe and certainly in the United States, you can't necessarily ensure long-term outcomes depending on an election cycle. How do you move forward and find that accountability?
Yeah, I can start. Transparency is key. So I think the moment that whether it's a government or a corporation is not transparent about its intentions and then how it lives up to those targets or intentions, you lose everything. How I think that what's would be really critical is if we would have common metrics, for example, for sustainable development goals that everybody can adhere to. And to give what you now see is that more and more methodologies are being created on how to account for the different sustainable development goals. Let me give one example for climate. There is a greenhouse gas protocol, which is a corporate standard for how you account for your greenhouse gas emissions. This was created by a number of competing companies working together, deciding, you know, we can compete with our product. We don't need to compete with how we measure it. So we decide to make that pre-competition. And building on that, for the freight sector, we worked on developing a greenhouse gas protocol essentially for freight and logistics. And it included companies like DHL, but also competitors like Geodis or DB Schenker, and multinationals like HP, Heineken, Unilever, Dow, who all decided we can compete on other fronts, and at this point we bring it before the competition. And having a standard set of metrics and methodologies that everybody agrees, at least let's agree on that, it means that it's easier to report against a common standard, hold companies and governments accountable. And what it also does, it frees up time to focus on the how. Because I think right now there's a disproportionate amount of corporate time spent on trying to communicate to stakeholders, put some KPIs and data out there just to sort of manage expectations and making look like you're doing really the right thing. But in the end, the stories that companies tell about how they're reducing emissions or how they're improving people's life is so much more important than being a little bit like being scared and sort of preventative measurement and accounting.
The cherry picking.
Yeah, so for me it's standardize the metrics and accountability for both corporations and governments, and then focus way more on the how. And we've discussed in our council, don't call it best practices, call it test practices. There's so much innovation and change that needs to happen. We can't have it all right at first go. So what's important is that the barriers are brought down and both countries and companies are daring to share what they've tried, what has worked and what hasn't, so that the entire sector and entire countries can learn from each other. And
you have to be willing to fail.
Yeah, and but share your failures, because that leads to success later on. Don't be scared to do that.
Well, on accountability, I think we have, for a very long time, the practice of being accountable to a very large group of stakeholders. Public university, of course, the general public, to our government, to our alumni, to the parents of our students, to our students. So it's highly developed. I think for us, if there's one thing that is a challenge, is to keep moving, because what is needed and how we can equip people for the future, the kind of learning environment we must provide them is always changing. So it's updating how we measure ourselves. We measure ourselves, that's been the case for many, many years, but it is the how we will do it to really be well linked to the realities of today and the future. That's our challenge.
So I agree, transparency is important, targets are important, metrics are important. So shared metrics for measuring inclusiveness, for example. We don't have many metrics on inclusiveness. Some people who've tried to look at the gender divide in the digital area. So is it having a device in your hand or connectivity? There are ways to measure it, but we're not yet agreed, all of us. So we need more of that. And I think what's most important is, and I agree that there is perhaps a tension between focusing too much on the why and the what, and not on the how. All three go together. So that's where you need a shared set of values and principles to test things out. When technologies are emerging, you don't have the law on hand. And so sometimes you have a very vague notion of ethics. So ethics provides you perhaps the ceiling, the law gives you the floor, and you really don't know where you are. So these values and principles give you a compass to chart your path. And they can be more easily understood across borders, because at the end of the day, we are all human. For me, in terms of accountability, the most important aspect is participation. If we exclude people whom we want to hold accountable from drawing up the metrics and the principles and the how and what of governance, they are going to say it's your touchstone, it's not my touchstone, and we'll end up pointing fingers at each other. So I think it's urgent to develop these things together. I see that in the cybersecurity domain. You know, you have a number of approaches, and there are all these splits, these tribes appearing, and we need to transcend that if we want to hold people accountable. Otherwise, we'll still keep getting hacked, and we'll have losses that end up in hundreds of billions of dollars, in the MERS case and other cases. So we need to transcend those tribes.
This is tough. I'm always the last of the line. What can I say that's different? So I think accountability is really difficult. You may have all the targets and you may have all the metrics, transparency, all these are important things, but what does it really mean, right? In the past, accountability has always been a name and shame sort of thing. If you're not with us, what is it? If you're not with us, you're not with us, whatever the saying is.
You're against us.
You're against us. And I'm coming from a different point of view. We're all facing the same future. It's not that a group of us are not facing this future. Everybody's facing the same future. So in order for me to be accountable and to be held accountable, I should feel accountable first. And the way for me to feel accountable is, to repeat myself, understanding how I move forward, realizing that I may not always be moving forward at the same speed that I was moving yesterday, but nevertheless moving forward, understanding that there is room to go backwards a bit, because we're all human and it's an uncertain future anyway, right? But I feel accountable enough because I appreciate and value and honor the goals that I want to get to. That's how, it's through my own accountability that I am accountable and I can be held accountable. That's kind of where I'm coming from. And that's why I have so much emphasis from where I sit on how to do things, you know? I mean, it's not enough to say, go and follow the SDGs. Well, what does that mean if I'm a company making socks? You know, what does that mean? You were talking about plastics, right? Yeah, I get that. I get where the issues are. But if I'm making socks and you're asking me to be accountable, what does that mean for me and what does the future look like for me?
So it goes back to education as well and feeling of being over crisis, because in the end it's messaging, no?
Yeah, I think, I mean, coming to the example of socks, I think if I would say, what I'm hoping is a shift of mentality in a company that says we're producing socks to we're keeping people's feet warm. You know, like the intent behind what you're trying to achieve as a company needs to be much more explicit. So the companies I come across often when I talk about sustainability, they start saying, oh, but we're zero emissions, we're aiming for 50% recycling. They not enough yet really talk about why does my company exist. So again, an example, Philips, for example, used to have 12 divisions, and now they're purely focusing on medical systems. And I think they've sorted it out, their messaging. They want to influence the health of people around the world, 3 billion people, in a positive way. Now then you're contributing in a positive way to society. Yes. And the moment so for me, accountability starts by defining for yourself, whether you're a country or whether you're or an individual or a company, is how, what am I here for? And then work back. How am I contributing to it? And then holding yourself accountable to that. Because otherwise you risk that, someone used the word in a session, ethics washing, you know, that you just tick the boxes, we've done that, but you're not being genuine about what you're really trying to achieve. And a comment related to that is about investors, which you haven't touched on yet. I would like the investment community to think like that as well. You're talking about returns and you're trying to perhaps eliminate, you know, the bad investments in terms of environmental social impact. You could also turn it round. And there is one in the council is from 17 Assets, and that's exactly what they do. They're looking at how can I invest for people in a way that does good. And in their example, they want to make sure that the investment goes to ways that help women be more productive. And so you're looking at what is the money going to do once I pull it out again? Has it left something in this planet that's for the good?
And that follows on to really mandating change, whether it be in corporates or as in the public sector as well. It's like, how do you mandate that? Just a few minutes left, and I wanted to kind of come back down the road, and we'll start with Usha, but you get to start and to end. No, but just in terms of the mandate going into Davos, I mean, this is the 50th anniversary. This is a really incredible moment, a watershed moment, frankly, for the organization and for those of us who participate every year, and the opportunity really to say that these are the things, these are the standards to which we are going to hold everyone accountable.
I think, absolutely, I think this is an important year for the forum. I think that Davos, this is going to be one of the most important Davoses, I think. And I think the mandate should be that there will be change because we see it coming down the pike. And you should adapt to it the best way you can. And you should build towards it the best way you can. But the most important thing is that you have to keep moving forward. Denial is probably not on the menu. You should realize that at least, whether you agree or not that those 4 things are going to define the future, just remember that the future is going to be different from the present. And please be accountable at your own unit level, whatever that unit may be, and move forward along a pathway that you design. That's the how. If I may just say, from an investor point of view, I think money and finance can be a great influencer of pathways and movements. And I think the investment the investment community is very much on that path now of saying, how can we utilize the power we have in terms of investing in things and lending to things to move things along a different pathway. So again, when you come to Davos and you bring the investor community together, it is about making them understand how they can be an influencer of good and an influencer of getting on the pathway to a world that we want to see. That's what I'd love to see as a mandate.
So we spoke of socks, stockings, and sandals. I want to bring another analogy. If Davos has been about speed dating and about feeling good, about launching things, getting excited about things, I think it has to be now going forward more about solid, sustainable relationships, where you actually get the private sector to put down some commitments. Like, I would love to see the bigger companies putting out data for SDGs as a public good, making that accessible to trusted, responsible communities of users, researchers on climate change, health issues, etc. And then asking the governments to also open up the space for that new generation of infrastructure, that new generation of technologies to be used for the greater good. So this would require trust across the private sector, because they compete a lot with each other, but maybe there are some areas like, for makers of catalytic converters to share data on emissions would allow them to improve the quality. Maybe it helps everyone. So it would allow, we would need to build that trust, also trust across these communities. I don't think this is a secret to anyone. Governments everywhere around the world are nervous at the power they are having to cede to the private sector. So we need to enable trust with the governments as well. And then that would help us, those targets, the why, what, and the how of collaborations, would help us to build the more sustainable relationships that we really need, move away from the speed dating, feel good, convene ourselves to the next version of...
The better version of ourselves. Fred.
Well, coming out of a 2-day speed dating experiment, I would say this, I found it actually interesting how we were described in the newspaper. There was a big ad that I saw yesterday, and all of us who are participating are described as futurists, scientists, and experts. And to me, the word that was missing is stakeholders. And I think this is what we have to get out of these wonderful gatherings, is that this is not just a place where experts meet and so on. It's a place where stakeholders meet. And that's where we ought to feel accountable, build those sustainable relationships, because we can feel both at a personal level, but also in our professional level, that this really matters. This is important. We are a stakeholder, all of us, in this future. And the one thing I would add is as much as I think I'm a stakeholder, I can tell you that there are a lot of people around me where I work who think they are much more important stakeholders than I am. And simply because their future is likely to be a whole lot longer than mine, and they really care about the future of the world. And to the extent that we can bring those stakeholders with us, I think will be very important.
Yeah, your question was about the mandate. For me, again, it comes back to collaboration. I think that what is really critical now is that rather than statements of individual CEOs or individual country statesmen, it's so important that what comes out of there is that there's genuine willingness to collaborate, to think across disciplines, across countries. A country does not stop at its borders. A company's boundaries do not stop at the factory gates. It includes the farmer picking the coffee bean, the truck driver taking the coffee bean to the port, etc. And so what's going to be really key is how do we make that collaboration happen. I'm also aware of death by initiatives. I don't know if any of you were at the New York Climate Summit, but there were so many new collaborations announced, it was confusing to many. So I think what's really key is to also try to really make sure that any collaboration, they don't all need to be announced. Maybe sometimes it's better to deliver something and then talk about what you've achieved instead of announcing collaborations too much.
Have you been watching Aramco IPO coverage?
Yeah, it's a lot. And the final thing, and it's more like a request for World Economic Forum. I think the mandate, I believe, has always been public-private partnerships. Civil society is missing in this. If we're going to survive the future and what's coming at us, network leaders, system thinkers, representatives who think about emission, about zero emissions, or no more who protect the forests, or have a gender, who have bigger aims at heart, need to be part of the table. I think it's time to make the WEF a more equivalent equilibrium between private sector, public sector, and civil society. So for me, if they could expand that mandate, I would be very happy.
Last word.
I just want to say that they have. That's the good news. So I worked with the forum on creating the 2030 Water Resources Group. And one of the absolute points of that is exactly what you defined, which is we've always seen public-private partnerships, or public-public and so on and so forth, but never the public-private community partnerships. And WRG, as it's popularly called, was predicated on that principle. And since then, the forum has done other such similar sort of partnerships, which brings community squarely into the discussion.
Oh, wonderful.
Just want to say.
No, that's good, thank you.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, panelists, so much for coming together and having this conversation. It's been a great experience to be with you guys tonight. And actually, we're going to leave it there, but there will be more to come, and all eyes will be on Davos and the World Economic Forum in just a few months from now. Thank you so much.